Okay, so you guys have sent in a ton of info about this new executive order about DEI.
Yeah,
And wow, people seem to have some pretty strong opinions about this.
absolutely.
It's definitely become a hot button issue.
For sure.
Yeah, like what started with the goal of trying to make workplaces and opportunities more fair for everyone
Right.
has really become super politically charged.
It has.
So our mission for this deep dive is to try to help you guys cut through the noise and figure out what this executive order actually means.
Yeah.
We've got some excerpts from the actual order itself.
Okay.
Then we also have this breakdown from Judge Joe Brown,
Wow.
who always brings a very unique perspective.
He does. He really does. I'm looking forward to diving into this with you.
Yeah, it should be interesting. So let's get started with Section 1 of the order,
Yeah.
which kind of lays out the purpose and the policy. And it jumps right in saying that the Biden administration pushed these DEI programs way too far,
Right.
and that they ended up being discriminatory and maybe even illegal.
Now, what's really interesting here is the framing.
Okay.
It's not just saying that these programs were maybe ineffective or anything.
Right.
It's actually saying that they violated existing civil rights laws.
Huh.
So it kind of raises the question, did DEI initiatives stray so far from that original purpose
Right.
that they actually became discriminatory themselves?
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
And it seems to connect with what Judge Joe Brown keeps bringing up,
What's that?
the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Oh, yeah?
He seems to view this executive order as a sort of course correction to bring things back in line with those original laws.
He says the historical context of that Civil Rights Act is really key here.
Okay.
He's saying that a lot has changed since 1964.
Right.
And he sees the continued reliance on these laws as a sign that things haven't progressed as much as they should have.
Yeah, he even uses the word pathetic at one point.
Really?
Yeah, it's like he's saying, come on, folks, it's 2025 time to move on.
Wow.
But is that a fair assessment?
Well, it's definitely provocative.
Yeah.
He's challenging this idea that historical inequities necessitate ongoing remedies,
Okay.
which is something that a lot of DEI proponents would say.
Right.
And he also points out the really high cost of pursuing Title VII lawsuits, which are often used to address workplace discrimination.
Right.
So his argument is that because these lawsuits are so expensive, a lot of people who actually experience discrimination can't use the law to protect themselves.
Okay, so moving on to Section 2,
Okay.
which focuses on implementation.
Mm-hmm.
It directs all federal agencies to basically get rid of anything that's DEI related,
Wow.
like firing chief diversity officers, canceling programs, scrubbing DEI language from websites,
Well,
the whole 9 yards.
So this section is really underscoring the administration's intent to just dismantle the existing DEI infrastructure
Right.
within the federal government.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how these directives actually play out in practice
Yeah.
across all the different agencies.
For sure. And it's not just the government, right? Section 4 strongly encourages private companies to follow suit.
Okay.
It says that the government should use its influence, including things like federal contracts,
Interesting.
to push private businesses to ditch DEI as well.
So this raises a crucial question then.
Yeah.
How will private companies actually respond to this?
Right.
I mean, some might feel pressure to comply so they don't jeopardize those government contracts.
Yeah.
Others might resist, especially if they think that DEI is really crucial to their values or their business.
Right.
Could create a dilemma for companies struggling to balance those pressures.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got this push to dismantle DEI at the federal level and a strong encouragement for the private sector to do the same. But Judge Joe Brown brought up something else that I wanted to get your take on.
Okay.
He kept saying that this executive order is void for vagueness.
Interesting.
Now, for those of us who aren't legal scholars, what does that even mean?
Well, it's a legal term that suggests that this order might not actually hold up in court.
Oh.
Because it doesn't clearly define the very concepts it's trying to prohibit.
Okay.
So Judge Brown's argument is that terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion are all open to interpretation. And that this vagueness makes it really difficult to actually enforce this consistently.
So he's essentially saying that you can't punish someone for running a DEI program
Right.
if no one can agree on what a DEI program even is.
Exactly. It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Yeah, and this ties into a bigger challenge with tackling complex social issues, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to throw around terms like diversity and equity.
Right.
But the devil's in the details when you actually try to implement it.
Sure.
What one person considers fair and inclusive, another might see as discriminatory or even harmful.
Absolutely.
So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's look at the potential impact.
No.
Section 3 zeroes in on federal contracting, which, as we mentioned, is a huge lever that the government can pull.
Right.
Basically, companies that want to do business with the government now have to prove that their DEI programs don't violate anti-discrimination laws.
So this could be a game changer for companies that are reliant on those government contracts.
For sure.
We might see a huge reshaping of how companies approach diversity and inclusion,
Right.
with a lot more emphasis on just demonstrating compliance.
Yeah, and this is where Judge Joe Brown had some very specific thoughts.
Hey, really?
He brought up this existing rule that requires federal contractors to have a certain percentage of employees who are people of color.
Okay.
And he basically argued that this rule, which was implemented at a very different time, is now outdated and potentially even counterproductive.
Interesting.
He compared it to affirmative action policies gone wrong, suggesting they've shifted from a shield to protect against discrimination into a boost that gives certain groups unfair advantages.
That's a powerful analogy.
Yeah, he seems to be suggesting that these rules that were intended to level the playing field might now be tilting it in the other direction.
And he also brought up the evolving demographics of the U.S., pointing out that in the coming years, we won't have a single majority group. So his implication is that clinging to these outdated rules designed to protect specific racial groups might actually become more and more problematic as we become more diverse.
So what does that mean for companies that rely on those federal contracts then?
Well, it seems like they'll need to really reevaluate their DEI programs and their hiring practices. And make sure that they align with this new emphasis on merit-based decisions, as the order calls it.
But as we've discussed, that term itself is open to a lot of interpretation.
It is.
Which could lead to even more confusion and potential legal challenges.
Yeah.
And Judge Joe Brown had something pretty blunt to say about that, too.
What was that?
He basically said that if you still need those kinds of advantages in 2025, you're doing something wrong. His exact words were, if you're in a position right now, in 2025, to have to rely on that from 60 years ago, you're pretty pathetic. Get your act together and take advantage of the opportunities to present yourself, because you don't need to conceive of yourself as a victim.
Wow, tell us how you really feel, Judge Brown.
Right. But he also brought up another element on this order that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
Even if it is kind of controversial.
What's that?
He seems to think that the true target of this executive order isn't racial or gender diversity at all. He thinks it's about something else entirely.
What do you mean?
Well, he used this pretty loaded phrase, the rainbow cult, to suggest that the real focus here is to push back against the inclusion of LGBTQ plus individuals.
Okay.
He even called out Hollywood as like the worst offender.
Interesting.
Claiming that there's this unspoken requirement to embrace certain sexual orientations to succeed. He went so far as to say that there's a whole propaganda campaign going on to make people accept these lifestyles.
Now, it's important to remember that this is just Judge Brown's personal opinion.
Right.
And a highly inflammatory one at that.
Yeah.
And the order itself doesn't even mention sexual orientation.
It doesn't.
But Judge Brown seems to think that it's the underlying motivation.
Okay, that's a good point. We always want to stick to the facts and what's actually in the order itself.
Right.
But his comments do raise a really interesting question.
What's that?
If this order's really all about merit, as it claims, how does that actually play out in practice? Could it be used as a way to discriminate against certain groups, even if it's not explicitly stated?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And one that I'm sure legal experts are going to be debating for a long time.
For sure.
The question of how we balance individual rights with these broader societal goals is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And this order seems to be wading right into that debate.
Okay, let's move on to Section 5.
Okay.
Which deals with freedom of speech. It essentially says that people can criticize this executive order without being punished.
Interesting.
Specifically mentioning college professors and their ability to still discuss DEI in their classrooms, even if the government isn't funding those programs anymore.
So this section is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it seems like the order isn't intended to stifle any open discussion or academic freedom.
Right.
Of course, how that plays out in practice, given our current political climate, remains to be seen.
For sure. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We looked at the purpose of this order, the legal arguments against it, the potential impact on federal contractors and education,
right?
Even the potential for some unintended consequences.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. It's a really dense and multifaceted order.
It is.
With some pretty far-reaching implications that we're really just starting to unpack.
Yeah.
So before we jump into even more specifics,
okay,
let's take a pause and consider what we've learned so far. What stands out to you as the most significant aspect of this whole thing?
I think for me, it's the framing of DEI as potentially discriminatory.
Okay.
This represents a huge shift in how we understand these concepts, both legally and politically.
Yeah.
It's almost like this order is flipping the script, turning DEI from a solution into a problem.
And for me, it's the question of those unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the goal is to promote fairness and merit, could this order inadvertently lead to new forms of discrimination or even further marginalize groups that are already disadvantaged?
Yeah.
These are questions that are going to require careful consideration and ongoing analysis as the impact of this order unfolds.
I agree. Those unintended consequences are definitely something to think about.
For sure.
It's a real tight roadblock.
Yeah.
Trying to ensure fairness and equal opportunity without accidentally creating new problems.
Exactly. Okay, so let's dive back into some more specifics.
Okay.
Section 6 of the order deals with education. And Judge Joe Brown had plenty to say about this.
I bet he did.
It basically instructs the Attorney General and the Secretary of Education to provide guidance to schools and colleges about how to comply with that recent Supreme Court ruling that basically struck down affirmative action in college admissions.
So this section's really suggesting that they're going to enforce that decision pretty strictly.
Yeah.
We could see big changes in how colleges choose their students.
Now, Judge Joe Brown seemed to be firmly in the camp of those who agreed with that Supreme Court decision.
Okay.
He argued that using race as a factor in college admissions was a form of discrimination, plain and simple.
Okay.
He believes that colleges should just focus on merit, not race.
And he even specifically mentioned the Case Students for Fair Admissions Inc. president and fellows of Harvard College.
Yeah.
Which was back in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big win for people who were against affirmative action.
You're right.
And this executive order seems to be kind of taking that and running with it.
Yeah. So does this mean that colleges are now completely banned from considering race when making admissions decisions?
Well, it's not quite that clear-cut.
Go.
The Supreme Court's ruling didn't totally ban it.
Okay.
But it did put some really strict limitations on how it can be used.
Okay.
Basically, universities can't make race a primary factor.
Okay.
But they can still consider it as one factor among many.
Okay. So it's more nuanced than a total ban.
Right.
But I'm curious, what was Judge Joe Brown's take on this?
Well, he took a pretty pragmatic approach here.
Okay.
He acknowledged that the educational landscape has changed a lot since the days of segregation and Jim Crow.
Right.
And that those injustices were the driving force behind affirmative action.
Right.
But he argued that clinging to those policies in today's world might actually be doing more harm than good.
So he's recognizing that historical context.
Yeah.
But suggesting it might be time for a new approach.
Exactly.
Interesting.
He even mentioned that in a few years, the concept of a majority and minority group will be kind of meaningless.
Right.
As demographics continue to shift.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how these categories we use to define ourselves might change over time.
It does.
Okay, back to the order.
Okay.
Section 7 deals with veterans and people with disabilities.
Okay.
And it clarifies that the order doesn't change any existing laws that grant those groups preferential treatment in hiring.
So this is important.
Yeah.
Because it shows that the order isn't trying to overturn all forms of affirmative action.
Right.
Just the ones that focus on race and gender and other identity categories.
So it's making very specific exceptions for certain groups.
Exactly. And it even mentions something called the Randolph-Shepard Act.
Okay.
Which gives people with visual impairments priority.
Okay.
For running vending machines and snack bars on federal property.
Wow. I had no idea.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's a reminder of how many different types of affirmative action programs there actually are.
There are a lot.
Okay, so let's recap for a second.
Okay.
We've gone through a ton of information about this executive order.
We have.
We've looked at the legal arguments against it.
Yeah.
The potential impact on federal contractors and education. And even that possibility of those unintended consequences.
Right. It's a lot to process.
It is.
And we've also considered Judge Joe Brown's perspective.
Right.
Which I think is really thought-provoking. Even if it's controversial.
Absolutely. He definitely doesn't shy away from a strong opinion.
He doesn't.
But ultimately, we're here to help you guys make sense of all this. So what does it all actually mean for you?
Well, honestly, A lot depends on your specific situation.
Right.
Are you a federal employee? A student applying to college?
Yeah.
A business owner who works with the government?
Right.
The impact is going to be different depending on you.
For sure. And it's important to remember that this is really just the beginning.
Yeah.
We're going to see legal challenges.
For sure.
And the way this order gets implemented will probably change over time.
Absolutely.
So we'll keep you updated on any new developments.
For sure.
But in the meantime, I think the most important thing is to stay informed.
Yeah.
Engage in those thoughtful discussions. Consider different perspectives. And keep in mind that this is a really complex issue with no easy answers.
I agree.
Okay, so let's end on a note that encourages some deeper thinking.
Okay.
Something for you guys to ponder.
Okay.
As you navigate this changing landscape, the order puts a lot of emphasis on merit.
It does.
But if that's the new focus,
Yeah.
how do we ensure that everyone actually has a fair shot at developing those skills and opportunities that they need to succeed?
That's such an important question.
Yeah.
True equality isn't just about tearing down those existing barriers.
Right.
It's about building pathways so that everyone can reach their full potential.
And that's going to require a lot more than just an executive order. It's going to require a fundamental shift in how we as a society think about merit, opportunity, and fairness.
I think you're right. Yeah, it really does make you think about those deeper questions, like how do we create a society where everyone has a real shot at success?
Right. Like, it's easy to throw around terms like meritocracy.
Yeah.
But as we've been talking about, it's not always that simple.
Right.
Judge Joe Brown actually touched on this when he said, and I'm quoting here,
Okay.
if you go back 50 years before 1973, when Jim Crow and segregation were absolute and ironclad, things have changed drastically.
Yeah. His point is that historical context really matters.
Right.
We've come a long way.
Yeah.
But we can't just erase the impact of discrimination.
Right.
It still affects people today.
It's like, even though those old laws are gone, the effects are still rippling through our society.
They are.
So when we talk about merit, how do we even begin to define that in a way that's fair?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Is it just about grades and test scores?
Yeah.
Or should it be about a wider range of things?
Right. It seems like if we define merit too narrowly, we risk just continuing those inequalities.
Right. Like take education, for example.
All right.
If we only look at test scores, we're ignoring the fact that some students have access to way better resources.
Right, like better schools, tutors, all of that.
A student from a disadvantaged background might have tons of potential.
Yeah.
But they just haven't had the same chances.
Right. So a true merit-based system would have to consider those differences.
Yeah.
It would have to level the playing field, like investing in good schools for everyone, providing support for students who need it, and creating opportunities for people from all backgrounds.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the core of this whole discussion.
Yeah.
This isn't just about quotas or hiring.
Right.
It's about a society where everyone has a chance.
Exactly. And that's going to take a lot more than just an executive order.
It'll take a real change in how we think about these things.
Absolutely.
Like merit, opportunity, what it means to be fair.
This order has definitely shaken things up.
It has.
And it started some important conversations.
For sure.
We'll have to see how it all plays out.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see.
It is.
But one thing's for sure, this conversation isn't over.
No.
We need to keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
And keep pushing for a future where everyone has a shot.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll be back soon with more on the topics that matter to you.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better tomorrow.